come together this morning to commemorate two brave pro-democracy activists, Samuel Lount and Peter Matthews, who were hanged here on the morning of April 12, 1838. This public execution, the reports are that there were 10,000 people here as witnesses, was punishment for their participation in the Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837, and was intended to discourage further dissent against the undemocratic government that was in place at the time. Our presence here 174 years later is testimony to an appreciation that their efforts and sacrifice contributed to the achievement of democracy in Canada today. We are all indebted to them and those like them who have stood up to undemocratic government and insisted that the only legitimate government is one which answers to the people's elected representatives. This commemoration is envisioned as an annual event, an occasion when we can come together to remember Samuel Lount and Peter Matthews and reflect on the effort and sacrifice which were required to achieve democracy in Canada and elsewhere. As public awareness is lacking concerning the contribution of William Lyon Mackenzie, Samuel Lount, Peter Matthews, and the other participants of the rebellion, we're including a kind of educational component in this commemoration. And our friend, historian, and author Randall White will be giving you an outline of the rebellion and highlighting its significance to Canada's political evolution. Then I will tell you a little about Samuel Lount and Peter Matthews as men, what we know about them, what roles they played in the rebellion, what happened to them later. And we will end the commemoration with 1 minute of silence, an opportunity to reflect on the bravery of Samuel Lount and Peter Matthews and on their willingness to put their lives on the line for their unwavering commitment to democratic reform, and also more generally to reflect on the efforts and sacrifice which have been required to achieve democracy in Canada and elsewhere. Before Randall comes up, I'd just like to introduce Peter Carruthers, a former chair of Heritage Toronto. We're very pleased that you could be here. And also Lloyd Johnston, who has come from Beaverton to be with us. And Beaverton was once part of Simcoe County. The people of Simcoe County elected Samuel Lount to represent them in the provincial legislature at the time. So we're very pleased that Lloyd can be with us. Lloyd, you should know, is also a blacksmith, as Samuel Lount was, and is an expert on Samuel Lount's career as a blacksmith, and actually owns some of the tools that Samuel Lount worked with himself. So we're very pleased to have him here. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Randall White, author and historian, the chief editor of political blogzine counterweights.ca. I've known Randall for quite a few years now, as we're both active in efforts to address the unfortunate reality that Canada's commitment to egalitarian democracy is still compromised and incomplete. And I have great appreciation and respect for Randall's contributions, including the very thorough and well-researched papers that he's prepared when these were needed in our efforts. So please welcome Randall White.
My assignment here, as Ashok has mentioned, as part of this commemoration of the sad hangings of Samuel Lount and Peter Matthews for their roles in the Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837, is to say a few words of introduction about the rebellion itself and its significance for our democracy today. There was a time when such an introduction would be less necessary than it is in the year 2012. On the 100th anniversary of the rebellion in 1937, the historian Stanley Ryerson published a book called 1837, The Birth of Canadian Democracy. In 1937 as well, our Prime Minister of the day William Lyon Mackenzie King, grandson of the 1837 rebellion leader William Lyon Mackenzie, spoke at the unveiling of a memorial arch in Niagara Falls honoring Mackenzie and his associates in the rebellion. According to press reports, the Prime Minister, and I'm quoting here, while lauding Mackenzie and those associated with him in the battle for freedom in Canada, declared that even more deserving of praise were the common people of that day, people whose names are not written in the nation's annals, but who were a self-reliant people. Of course, there have always been and still are those who would complain that Stanley Ryerson was a communist, and that, almost as bad, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King was a liberal who took political advice from psychics. Yet Stanley Ryerson was a very unusual communist who had gone to the local elite private high school of Upper Canada College and was descended from the Edgerton Ryerson, who did so much for the early Ontario public education system. Ontario's progressive conservative premier of the 1950s, Leslie Frost, might have been describing Stanley Ryerson when he said of the two communist members of the Ontario legislature of the day, Joseph Salzberg and Alex MacLeod, those two had more brains between them than the rest of the opposition put together. They weren't communists really, but dissenters, dissatisfied young men of their time. Often I'd just grab off one of their ideas. Meanwhile, William Lyon Mackenzie King continues to hold the record for longest time served in office among all prime ministers of the 1867 Confederation. And while not an easy person to altogether admire, he was, in the title of the now classic and recently republished 1950s biography of him by the eminent Ottawa journalist from Vancouver, Bruce Hutchison, the incredible Canadian. Despite Prime Minister Mackenzie King's more or less warm words about his grandfather in 1937, the almost immediate opinion of most who have studied the matter would be that he and William Lyon Mackenzie were at virtually opposite ends of some human spectrum. Far from being any sort of rebel, that is to say, Mackenzie King was an abject, if sometimes artful, compromiser. His most characteristic political slogan arose during the divisive debate on compulsory military service in the Second World War: conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. This slogan can be and has been applied to many other aspects of political life in Canada. One key thought I hope to leave in the air this morning is that William Lyon Mackenzie had at least a few more things than we might at first think in common with his grandson, William Lyon Mackenzie King. And a rebellion, if necessary, but not necessarily a rebellion, is in fact a rather apt summary of what actually happened in 1837. To summarize as quickly as I can, the Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837 was the present-day Ontario companion to the more formidable Lower Canada Rebellion of 1837-38 in present-day Quebec. Its leader, William Lyon Mackenzie, was also the first mayor of the city of Toronto. The underlying issue was the stridently stubborn refusal of the province's early political and economic oligarchy, a kind of vainly aspiring backwoods aristocracy, to allow for any significant popular role in government. Local crop failures in the pioneer family farm society and the international financial panic of 1837 helped mobilize support for Mackenzie's cause, which was also the radical wing of a broader regional reform movement. The military side of the actual rebellion inside what is now Ontario was confined to the first few weeks of December 1837. Mackenzie and several hundred followers made an unsuccessful attempt to capture the provincial capital of Toronto between December 5 and 8. His colleague Charles Duncombe and a smaller force attempted an even less successful rising in the Brantford area a few days later. Mackenzie, Duncombe, and other participants then managed to escape to exile in the United States. Others were not so lucky, including Samuel Lount and Peter Matthews. In 1838 as well, there were a number of border raids led by American patriot sympathizers of the Canadian rebels, and these resulted in a dozen or so further executions and many more deportations to Australia, of all places. The Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837 has been belittled by some unsympathetic later observers, but it cast a troubled shadow across the province in its time, and soon enough helped show the British imperial officials the way to the broader reform movement demand for so-called responsible government, the beginnings of our modern Canadian parliamentary democracy in 1848. Mackenzie himself was pardoned in 1849 and allowed to return to Canada, where he resumed his political career. As the historian Arthur Lower explained long ago, he and his colleagues stood for the many against the few, for democracy against privilege. They put their bodies on the line for the free and democratic society that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Constitution Act 1982 guarantees to people of Canada today. As I hope my last remarks here have made at least vaguely apparent, I think the Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837 has left two main legacies for our democracy today. The first relates to the practical evolution of our political institutions. The British imperial concession of the broader reform movement demand for responsible government in 1848 would, at the very least, not have come so quickly without the two Canadian rebellions in what are now Ontario and Quebec some 10 years before. What responsible government means here technically, so to speak, is that the executive is accountable to the majority in the elected legislature or parliament. This is the essence of so-called Westminster parliamentary or cabinet government, and in Canada as elsewhere, it subsequently became increasingly democratic with the expansion of the right to vote. Not everyone wants to agree that the 1837-38 rebellions hastened the advent of colonial parliamentary government in the old British North America. There are those who don't like to think that any form of resort to political violence was necessary for progress in this direction. I agree myself that in our own time the non-violent philosophies of Gandhi and Martin Luther King are better guides to our future. But political realism in the middle of the 19th century was not so kind and gentle, and if you look at all realistically at the Canada of the 1830s and 1840s, the rebellion, if necessary, but not necessarily a rebellion, certainly played a role in the achievement of responsible parliamentary government, which finally helped set the stage for the 1867 Confederation. At the same time, it is true as well, I think, that people like Mackenzie and Lount and Matthews were, in some general sense, the first to start talking about democracy seriously in our regional political debate. And in the end, they meant something broader than parliamentary political institutions when they used the term. Prime Minister Mackenzie King alluded to a philosophy closer to this broader meaning in his 1937 remarks at Niagara Falls, when he talked about how, in the battle for freedom in Canada, even more deserving of praise were the common people of that day, people whose names are not written in the nation's annals. Intriguingly enough, this reminds me of some sentences written in the 1960s by the Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who was so important in giving us the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Constitution Act 1982. In Canada, we have had few decisive battles and not many dominant leaders. Much more important to our history has been the struggle of nameless Canadians to improve their lives in our often hostile environment. Democracy in this sense is also, no doubt, never completely realized in a global village of imperfect humanity. And I think the ultimate message to us from the honored ghosts of William Lyon Mackenzie, Samuel Lount, Peter Matthews, and all the others in the Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837 is plain enough. In our own ways, suited to our own times, we owe it to them, and more importantly to ourselves, to continue with the ongoing struggle for a more strong and free Canadian democracy than they began. And I must say, no one has done this more in his life than Charles Roach, who we're very happy to see has come in the midst of his current difficulties. And terrific to see you, Charles.
Thank you. Yes, brilliant.
I'm glad you could join us, Charles. And Tony O'Donoghue, who's a past city councillor of Toronto, is also here with us. So thanks again, Randall. Samuel Lount arrived in Canada from the United States in 1818 and settled in Holland's Landing north of Newmarket. At various times he was a businessman, a farmer, a surveyor, a blacksmith, and a politician, and was successful in all of these professions. He and his wife Elizabeth raised 7 children. You can get some sense of his physical appearance from the wording of a wanted poster that was circulated after the rebellion had failed and the authorities were after him. The poster described him this way: a tall man, say 6 feet or rather more, long face, sallow complexion, black hair with some gray in it, very heavy dark eyebrows, speaks rather softly. That was his wanted poster. Lount was one of those individuals who, through their competence, goodwill, and generosity, assume a central role in their community. He gained a reputation as a man who could be relied upon in times of need, and many new settlers and First Nations people in the area benefited from his help. His involvement with a pacifist Quaker sect called the Children of Peace, which was based in the town of Hope, was also a big part of his life. Lount's qualities and civic engagement prompted members of his community to urge him to seek public office. He declined at first, but in 1834, he stood for election to the Provincial Assembly and won handily. While in the assembly, he worked to incorporate a farmers' cooperative. Politically, he was aligned with the reformers who sought to shift power from the appointed Legislative Council, many of whom were part of the Family Compact, a notorious conglomerate which controlled the government and used it to favor their own interest and ensure their own prosperity. Lount's political views were in accord with William Lyon Mackenzie, the most outspoken of the reformers, and Lount took an active role in the rebellion that Mackenzie spearheaded. He was given the title of Colonel Lount during that engagement, and he acted basically as Mackenzie's right-hand man during the rebellion. There is good evidence that Lount and many of the rebels were optimistic that the more democratic government they envisioned could be installed without bloodshed. Those hopes, of course, were dashed, but in the heat of the conflict that came about, Lount's pacifist nature was still evident. The first casualty of the rebellion was an angry Family Compact member, Colonel Moody, who fired a warning shot to intimidate the rebels and was then shot himself. While he lay mortally wounded, Lount ensured that he had the best possible care and did his best to send for medical aid. Later, when the rebels were on the march towards the city, Lount dissuaded Mackenzie, who by many accounts was acting rather erratically that day, from burning down the sheriff's house. So in other words, he told him it's inappropriate to be committing an act of vandalism during this political engagement. So that's Lount for you. Hardworking, successful, generous, someone who had the love and respect of his family and his community, and someone who at a crucial point took on the role of pro-democracy activist despite the risks. Now, Peter Matthews. Matthews was a big, powerful man, over 6 feet tall, who fought in the War of 1812, serving under General Brock. He later settled in the Pickering area and became a successful farmer. He had 8 kids, and like Lount, was politically active and a pillar of his community. He was also a reformer and joined the rebellion, bringing many men with him. The assignment he received from Mackenzie was to lead a division of 60 men and burn down the bridge over the Don River as a diversionary tactic. And this he accomplished. Now let's talk about the convictions. Why would these men, successful pillars of their community, engage in an uprising of this nature, like the rebellion? So I'm going to read, to give you an idea of their motivation, I'm going to read to you a resolution that was passed at a meeting of these unions that formed before the rebellion. These were unions of reformers who were organizing themselves to effect change. Not necessarily, as Randall was saying, not necessarily a rebellion, but a rebellion if necessary. So they were organizing themselves. And here is a resolution which encapsulates their convictions. That government is founded on the authority and is instituted for the benefit of a people or community, and not for the benefit, honor, or profit of any man or any class of men. So this resolution that I've just passed, it's very likely that Samuel, Lount, and Peter Matthews read it themselves, probably knew who had recorded it. When the rebellion was put down, Lount and Matthews were captured and were convicted of treason and sentenced to hang. Their punishment was intended to demonstrate the regime's power and discourage further dissent against it. Lount's family was not allowed to visit him in prison for the first 2 months of his incarceration. He was held in chains in dungeon-like conditions. At the time of their executions, Matthews was 52 and Lount was 47. The story of Lount and Matthews' execution must be told in the words of a man who shared their cell in the grim institution that occupied the northeast corner of King and Toronto Street. So here's an eyewitness report. The hours of April 12th, 1838 were the saddest we ever spent. None of us could sleep, and we were all early astir. It was a fine, cool spring morning. Looking through the window of our room, we saw the scaffold. It was built by the late Mr. Storm. His foreman was Matthew Sheard, then a fine young Yorkshireman and afterwards mayor of Toronto, mayor of the city. He was expected to share in the work of building the scaffold. "I'll not put a hand to it," he said. "Lount and Matthews have done nothing that I might not have done myself, and I'll never help to build the gallows to hang them." So without the foreman's assistance, the gallows was created near the spot where the police court building now stands. Around the gallows, the Orange militia stood in large numbers with their muskets. The authorities dreaded a rescue. While we were watching and talking, we heard steps on the stairs and then the clank of chains. It was poor Lount coming up, guarded by his jailers, to say goodbye to us. He stopped at the door. We could not see him, but there were sad hearts in that room as we heard Samuel Lount's voice, without a quiver in it, give us his last greeting. "Be of good courage, boys. I'm not ashamed of anything I have done. I trust in God, and I'm going to die like a man." As they passed fellow prisoners on their way to the scaffold, Lount is reported to have said, "We die in a good cause. Canada will yet be free." Lount and Matthews moved slowly to the ladder and mounted its 8 steps to the gallows without stumbling. They left life as they had lived it, with complete calmness and self-control. When they reached the top of the scaffold, Lount turned slowly and bowed to the hundreds of heads that watched from the windows of the prison. He and Matthews then knelt in prayer. For the last time, they looked up at the sky, then at the faces of those around them. White hoods were placed over their heads and the noose tightened around their necks. The freezing air was unbroken by any sound. All eyes were fixed on the two big men. The trapdoor opened, the ropes hummed taut, and side by side they plunged to their deaths, early morning hours of Thursday, April 12, 1838. The authorities did not want posthumous honors paid the men, so they refused to hand the bodies over to the men's families and instead buried them in a pauper's cemetery which was located just off Bloor Street. 21 years later, Mackenzie, who had escaped to the States, but by then had been pardoned and returned to Canada, Mackenzie and Lount's sons had the bodies reinterred to the Toronto Necropolis Cemetery, where they are now, just west of the Don Valley. In 1893, a monument was erected at their gravesite by friends and sympathizers to commemorate them. It is surmounted by a broken granite column to symbolize worthy lives cut short. So now, as I said in the introduction, I'd like us to share in 1 minute of silence to reflect on the bravery of Samuel Lount and Peter Matthews and on the efforts and sacrifice which have been necessary to achieve democracy in Canada and around the world. Thank you, Samuel Lount. Thank you, Peter Matthews, for your sacrifice. It has touched us all. And I thank you all for joining the gathering with us today. Now, Charles Roach.
This is not going to be an address at all. It's a song. Rise up, oh Canada, it's about time, it's about time. Rise up, oh Canada, it's about time, it's about time. Embrace sovereign independence, cast off imperial legacies. Rise up, Republic of Canada, it's about time, it's about time. Rise up, rise up. Rise up, 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 rise up.